Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for making it through these April showers to join us this afternoon for Writing in the Dark, a genealogy of Black letters and lives. We're here today with a novelist and playwright, an essayist, and Professor Caryl Phillips. I'm Ollie, a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of African American Studies here at Princeton. And I first met Caryl Phillips at Yale University, where he's a professor, and where I pursued my PhD as part of a class on Caribbean diasporic intellectuals. And it is with great pleasure that I welcome him to Princeton, where I'm teaching a course called Islands in the Sun Caribbean Literature, and that I'm able to introduce him as a guest to my students. But even before meeting Caryl Phillips some years ago at Yale, I knew Caryl Phillips through his letters, through his work, which was integral to shaping a conception of Black Europe, through his writing on the Black British experience. And this was especially formative for me as a migrant, a Black Briton who migrated to the United States as a child. We have talked with each other about what it means to be in America, to embrace America, and what it means to become a U.S. citizen. Phillips writes of intimacies and the entanglements of the colonial migrant experience. He stitches multiple narratives of characters together, facing what he speaks of as vexing issues of belonging and participation for colonial migrants once they cross the water or the river. The characters he writes are ones that I know and I feel as though I've always known. They defy what some see as the incongruity of being both Black and British in one body. This event is part of the Princeton University Campus Conversations on Identities and is generously sponsored by the Department of African American Studies, the Council of the Humanities, the Department of English, the Lewis Center for the Arts, the Department of Comparative Literature, and the student group, the Princeton Caribbean Connection, all of whom I would like to thank for their support. And I would also like to thank Bill Gleason, Simon Gakandi, Eddie Glad, Kanohi Nishikawa, Sarah Chihaya, Wendy Belcher, Tracy K. Smith, and Kathy Crown for their advice and assistance in putting today's events together. In addition, I would like to thank the staff of African American Studies, Dion Worthy, April Peters, Allison Bland, and Elio Yeo, who have been invaluable in making today happen. So, born in St. Kitts, West Indies, Caryl Phillips migrated with his family to the United States, he says, as hand luggage, at the age of 4 months old. His family was one of the many to make the journey during the mass migration of people from the Caribbean islands to Britain in post-World War II. He grew up in Yorkshire in the north of England and Leeds before attending Oxford University, where he earned a degree in English. Phillips thereafter began writing plays, novels, and essays, dealing with issues and themes of race, identity, the migrant experience, composed while living at various times between England, St. Kitts, and the United States. A prolific author, his early theater work includes Strange Fruit, The Shelter, and The Wasted Years. He has published 10 novels, including The Final Passage, Crossing the River, and last year's The Lost Child, which plays with the landscape of England's north and reimagines Emily Bronte's Heathcliff. England has changed, writes Phillips. The psychic crisis and anxiety over the waning of British Empire are among the themes that he tackles in his writing. Phillips' many literary awards and recognitions include the Martin Luther King Memorial Prize, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a British Council Fellowship, and Britain's oldest literary award, the James Tate Black Memorial Prize for Crossing the River, which was also shortlisted for the 1993 Man Booker Prize. He has also won the 2004 Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and for Dancing in the Dark, his imagining of blackface minstrelsy in the story of Bert Williams, he won the 2006 PEN Open Book Award. In addition to his writing being translated into a dozen languages, Phillips holds 6 honorary doctorates and is taught at universities in Ghana, Sweden, Singapore, Barbados, and India. He is presently professor of English at Yale University, where he teaches courses that range from contemporary British fiction to literatures of the Middle Passage. Professor Phillips writes of what it means to be the product of British imperial adventures and what it means to be a stranger in the village, what it means to be estranged. In this conversation on Black Lives and Letters, we will discuss what it means to play in the dark, as Toni Morrison says, to dance in the dark, to write in the dark. Whiteness depends on what Morrison sees as a constitutive American Africanness. In a similar fashion, Phillips explores various darker identities that constitute Europeanness and the ways in which it depends on the fraught anxieties that are at the heart of deepest, darkest Europe, that tries and fails to suppress the atrocities of colonialism. In his anthology, Extravagant Strangers, Phillips troubles the meaning of place of birth by presenting British literature written by authors who were not born in Britain: George Orwell, T.S. Eliot, Jean Rhys, V.S. Naipaul, and Kazuo Ishiguro. The New York Times recently wrote that Phillips is seen by many as the father of Afro-British fiction, and his work deals with the experiences of people of the African diaspora as they relate to the UK, the US, and the Caribbean. Among the forebears and genealogical links he has made are Derek Walcott, James Baldwin, Miles Davis, Linton Kwesi Johnson, and Chinua Achebe. So today, Professor Phillips will read from his work, and we will talk about the genealogy or lineage of his work and his literary influences. Our conversation will focus primarily on the European tribe, Phillips's revisioning of the European Grand Tour from the eyes of a native son of Britain that tackles the ways in which we are scripted into different contexts and spaces. And my students read this week, so we'll be able to open up the conversation later on about this text. We will also discuss a range of topics from the current migrant crisis to James Baldwin, police violence, and many other topics. And then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So books are available for purchase and to be signed, and that can take place at the end of our conversation. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Caryl Phillips, who's joining us at Princeton today.
Well, excuse me. Thank you to everybody for, as Tao said, coming out in the April showers. And thank you very much, Tao, for that generous introduction. I've been trying to figure out how long it is since I was at Princeton. 20 years maybe, I'm not sure. But anyway, I'm happy to be back here and to see some familiar faces and some new faces. As Tao said in her introduction, her class have been reading The European Tribe, which is a book which was published, a book of essays that was published in 1987. And when she asked me to say a few words, well, more than a few words, I think she had in mind, before our conversation, I thought I would revisit the book a little bit through the prism of 2016. So I'll say some words about this book. This year marks 32 years since I set off for Moscow to begin a long solo odyssey that would eventually that I set off for Morocco to begin a long solo odyssey that would eventually end in Moscow, the capital of the old Soviet Union. 3 years after completing the journey, a book, if you like, the book of the journey, was published, The European Tribe. I did a few interviews, I did some readings up and down Britain, a couple of television and radio appearances, and then, especially in the light of the upsurge of opinions that the book appeared to have provoked in certain quarters, I was happy to move on and to attempt to begin work on something new. Around the same time, I also decided that I was going to leave Britain for a while and go and live in the Caribbean. Only now does it strike me that perhaps this decision was in some way related to the reception of the book. I was fed up and disillusioned with life in London, and having travelled all around Europe, I'd had plenty of time to consider where else in Europe I might retreat to in order that I might temporarily escape Mrs. Thatcher's Britain. The answer, of course, was nowhere. I'd seen similar problems to those plaguing Britain in nearly every place I visited. The year after the book was published, I temporarily closed up shop in London. I rented out my house and I took off for the Caribbean, where I based myself for a few years. Once there, I began work on another novel, this one set in the Caribbean, and it was over 10 years before I revisited non-fiction, which I did with the publication of The Atlantic Sound in the year 2000. In the interim, I was approached any number of times by publishers keen for me to do another version, an updated version of my European journey. There was even some discussion about a series of television programs with yours truly retracing his steps. I imagined that this would most likely involve me checking into a series of somewhat depressing hotels. I would be filmed making long overnight train journeys from one country to another just to have somewhere to sleep. Perhaps the producers would even go so far as to attempting to stage chance encounters with supposed strangers. In the end, it all seemed a little too clumsy to me, so the idea of a television series was mercifully soon shelved. However, in recent years, there have continued to be occasional approaches from various publishers encouraging me to recreate the journey, but I've resisted the urge to go back. One of the reasons I've shied away from writing another version of the book is that it seems to me that, broadly speaking, so little has changed in Europe that I would, aside from some factual details, i.e. the Berlin Wall has come down, Yugoslavia has fractured along ethnic lines, I would essentially be making the same journey, albeit in hopefully less arduous circumstances. Furthermore, I'm reasonably sure that I would simply end up reaching pretty much the same conclusions. So, what were the conclusions that I reached all those years ago? Here's the final paragraph of the European Tribe. Europe is blinded by her past and doesn't understand the high price of her churches, her art galleries, and her architecture. My presence in Europe is part of that price. I was raised in Europe, but as I walked the tiny streets of Venice with all their self-evident beauty, I felt nothing. Unlike Othello, I am culturally of the West. I stood on the Rialto and I thought how much more difficult it must have been for him, possessing a language and a past that was still present. Nothing inside of me stirred to make me rejoice. Ours is a rich culture, or I'm a part of this. I responded coldly to the aesthetics, but recognized the traditions. I could find little empathy with the cultural bravado of a Eurocentric past. Should I have made an effort I knew would never be reciprocated? Despite my education, I found myself then, and still now, unable to engage with a Eurocentric and selfish history. Black people have always been present in Europe, in a Europe that has chosen either not to see us or to judge us as an insignificant minority or as a temporary but dismissible mistake. I looked down at the Grand Canal and realized that our permanence in Europe no longer relied upon white European tolerance or the liberal embrace, but made a much more radical demand. Europe must begin to restructure the tissue of lies that continues to be taught and digested at school and at home, for we, black people, are an inextricable part of this small continent, and Europeans must learn to understand this for themselves, for there are among us few who are here as missionaries. 30 years on, there's hardly a word that I disagree with in the conclusion to the book. And I think that much of the urgency is still necessary, so why indeed make the journey to arrive at a familiar place? Were I to start another pilgrimage and revisit these places, I feel sure that many of the issues would be as problematic as they were a generation or two ago. That said, there would, of course, be some new issues to consider. I'd want to explore the rise of violence in Paris, and I'd try and achieve a fuller consideration of Islam, which is pretty much absent in the book, apart from my visit to Spain. I might also go and look at what is happening in a country such as Sweden. And what else? Well, back then I didn't visit Greece, but because of the emergence of the far right, I think I might be tempted to now. A return visit to Dresden and to Leipzig in the former East Germany, and time spent revisiting Poland and Russia would also give me a pretty fast update on the official and unofficial rise of the right in Europe. Of course, Europe has changed, and these changes would have to be factored into any new consideration of the European tribe. But it's the conclusions that most concern me. These, I still maintain, might well be pretty much the same as they were 30 years ago. As I began to think about the possibility, from time to time, of setting off once more across Europe, I tried to wrap my head around the practical ways in which such a journey might be different. Back then, there was no such thing as the internet, and there were no mobile phones. If I wanted to get in touch with anybody, I had to find a phone box and arm myself with a stack of coins of the right currency, or else risk bankruptcy by picking up a hotel telephone and making an international call. I travelled, of course, with traveller's checks and without credit cards, and was forever changing currency, for there was, of course, no such thing as a euro. Obviously, I heard from nobody via email or text, and being continually on the move, I received no mail. It was a very isolated period of my life, and one of the many troubling practical issues that I had to deal with was what exactly should I do with all the books that I was buying along the way, which cumulatively began to weigh down my bag. These days, I suppose I'd invest in a Kindle or something, but back then I was reluctant to part company with any books. Every couple of days or so, I was able to afford an English language newspaper, and in this way I could find out what was happening in the world. However, many of the social and political events of 1984 passed me by, and I only caught up with them over Christmas and New Year when I finally returned to London. Thinking about the practical ways in which a present-day journey might be different reminded me of all these difficulties, but in the end I realized that were I to undertake the journey today, the biggest change that I would face would not be anything to do with new boundaries on the map of Europe, or changes of political philosophy in the bosom of the continent, or the accessibility of technological gadgetry that would keep me connected. The major change, actually, would be visibility. I lost count of the number of times I walked into a bar, or a hotel, or a restaurant, or a train station, or a museum, or an art gallery, only to have heads snap around and gaze at me in bewilderment. Who was I? What was I doing here? Where did I come from? The awkwardness of such encounters didn't bother me too much, for I'd experienced the same head snapping in Britain from as far back as I could remember. And of course, as a child in Britain, I knew that the looks grew more puzzled the further one drifted from urban centres. School trips to Wales or the Lake District or Dorset had taught me that the look was something I'd have to get used to. So encountering it in Madrid or in Paris or in Finnish Lapland didn't trouble me. Part of the education of any non-white child involves trying to work out very quickly what exactly the snapping of the head signifies. To assume hostility is to capitulate to a kind of defeat. The look is often little more than curiosity, but it requires a tremendous amount of energy to have to constantly negotiate a position in response to this look. Why not, one might ask, just ignore it? Well, to do so might well be dangerous. One has to know, and to be able to figure it out quickly For most of my time traveling across Europe, I was perceived to be a West Indian, a black American, an African, or some other things that it's probably best not to give a name to. Offhand, I can't remember ever being referred to as British, but I'm sure this happened, for Britain was and still is the most visibly non-white European nation. However, what I'm sure of is that it was never assumed that I might be a European. Visibility in the fields of sport and popular culture, notably music, was how many African Americans first emerged on the national stage. And in Britain in the 1980s, musicians and footballers and athletes and others did a great deal to dramatize the reality of a black British presence. They helped to introduce the idea that such a fusion of race and nationality was possible, even if it wasn't welcomed. And although they could do little to dispel the head snapping which continues to this day, back then they certainly broadened the context in which we thought of national identity. And of course some of this was also happening in France and in Holland. However, the same could not be said of most of the other territories across which I traveled. My contention that visibility would be the greatest difference were I to travel again is largely fueled by the present day evidence of non-white participation in sport and popular culture, particularly music, all across Europe. This participation paves the way for the possibility of beginning to think anew about nationality. The footballer Mario Balotelli is forcing such a debate in Italy. The captain of Sweden, Zlatan Ibrahimovic, has done so there. Germany and Poland have non-white footballers wearing the national shirt. It's no longer just Britain and France and Holland reluctantly embracing the backwash of empire and sending them out to take part in the games period. To set out now and to gaze at Europe from the vantage point of Morocco, I would be looking at a continent where it would be difficult to find a place where there was not some consciousness of non-white people as unwelcome visitors or as participants or as citizens. That certainly was not the case 30 years ago. And while it would inevitably make for a different kind of book, one which was attempting to grapple with the new realities of early 21st century Europe, the book would, I believe, still arrive at pretty much the same conclusions. However, the imagined futility and frustration of traveling for months in order that I might arrive at basically the same conclusions, it really isn't the main reason why I wouldn't want to travel again and revisit the European tribe. In the foreword to the volume, I state that the book shies away from the academic or the theoretical in its exploration of identity, nationality, and belonging. What in fact really fuels a book of this kind is not so much analysis, but encounter. Hopefully, many encounters with people through which the richness of the whole experience can be distilled. To travel again, I would naturally enough have to encounter new people. But a good number of those that I spent time with in 1984 and would wish to see again are no longer with us. I would travel mourning their absence. And while I would discover new people along the way, these new people would always be substitutes. To revisit the project would be to begin a personal journey towards grief. I would miss Rufus Collins, with whom I spent time in Amsterdam. He died of AIDS shortly after the book was published, as did the writer James Baldwin, who died in 1987 in the south of France, and Paul Webster, the Guardian's man in Paris. Others have also been lost. A little over 4 years ago, I received the news that one young woman who didn't even make it into the book had died. I met Robin Hirschberg at about 1 a.m. on a Sunday morning at the Swedish border with Finland at the top of the Baltic. Back then, most sensible people wanting to travel from Stockholm to Helsinki took the overnight ferry. Those with limited budgets took the train, which lumbered up and around the Baltic Sea. Those with no money sat upright on the train through the night, as opposed to booking a sleeper. I was one of those sitting upright on the train, with some books spread out before we. As we inched our way up the coast, I remember a Nigerian man passing through the carriage and stopping to talk with me. He looked to me like a businessman or a doctor, and he was fascinated by my notebooks and my notepads and my books. I told him that I was hoping to make a life of some kind for myself as a writer, and we talked about Sweden and other things that I've long since forgotten. However, when it got dark, he asked me if I wasn't going to my sleeper, and I told him no, I'd be spending the night in my seat. I remember the look of surprise on his face as he left, and then sometime later he came back and he pressed about £25 worth of krona on me as a gift, and then he left quickly, having wished me good luck. It was a precious gift. I really was running out of money. Some hours later, I found myself standing in the freezing cold, for I didn't realize that we had to change trains. Apparently, Finnish trains worked on the Russian wide gauge, and therefore Swedish trains couldn't cross the border. The platform was windswept. I was freezing, and somehow I fell into conversation with a Canadian couple who had sold everything in order to get married and travel around the world, and a young American woman from Maryland who was visiting with her German boyfriend in Frankfurt. The four of us got into the same carriage of this new train, and we talked pretty much through the night as we slid down the other side of the Baltic towards Helsinki. Thereafter, we all checked into the same hotel. I don't remember much, aside from the fact that the Canadian couple were not getting on, and the husband and I went in search of a bar in the middle of some forest, leaving Robin and the Canadian woman at the hotel. After a couple of days, I left all three of them in Helsinki, but I had Robin's phone number in Frankfurt, as I'd promised her that I would call when I got there. Arriving late one Saturday afternoon, I found a phone box and I called, and she turned up at the train station, and we had a drink in the station bar, and then she confessed that her boyfriend wasn't really too keen on a traveller crashing on their sofa. And I said, no problem. I watched her leave, and then I scanned my Thomas Cook International train timetable, and I caught an overnight train to Italy in order that I could save money and have somewhere to sleep for the night. I never saw Robin again. Over the years, I kept in touch with her, for she too wanted to be a writer. The odd postcard or brief letter was the extent of our communication. She settled back in Maryland, got married, but I never knew much of what else she did aside from the fact that there was a daughter. And then she tracked down my email address, and 5 years ago sent me an email saying that she had cancer, but would I read the manuscript of a novel that she'd just finished. I read it. I wrote to her, and it was her husband who replied and said she'd just died. As I've stated, for me, the European tribe is as much about encounter as it is about issues. Many of these encounters are in the book. Many, such as the story of the Nigerian man on the train and the 2 brief moments with Robin Hirschberg, are not, but they were transformative. I could take the publisher's money and travel again with the issues uppermost in my mind, knowing that I would probably arrive at a familiar conclusion. True enough, I would find new people along the way and make new encounters, but I'm afraid I would grieve for those who have left. As I've written elsewhere, there are no paths in water, no return journey. I can't go back. I spend enough time in Europe to know that despite the evidence of increased visibility of non-white people and our increased participation in European life, during the past 30 years, precious little has changed for a person who looks like me. The struggle to participate and to see and be seen is as urgent as ever. A whole generation are in danger of being bamboozled into political apathy by the drivel of politicians who want us to believe that all is well in multicultural, multiracial Europe. Another part of the same generation is feeling tired and suffering from some form of assimilation fatigue. They don't want to know. They blow up buses, they stab soldiers, and one shouldn't be fooled into thinking that Islam is to blame for this, because it's not. People have always embraced extreme and often corrupt notions of identity in order to justify their actions. It's nothing new. Foolishness and disaffection are palpable in Europe. The hostility from the right continues to be evident, but it was all those years ago. I began by reading from the conclusion of the European Tribe. I'll conclude by reading from the final paragraph of the introduction to the American edition of the book. And as with the concluding paragraph, although these words were written many years ago, I really don't think that I'd change a thing. I wrote the European Tribe while consumed with the anxieties of knowing that I was a member of the larger European Tribe, a member who felt uncomfortable at being such, but who had no visible alternative. In the interim, I have forged some alternatives, and I therefore look at Europe with perhaps a little more detachment. I continue to travel extensively across this land that I feel both of and not of, but I sometimes wonder if it's an exercise in futility to worry over the health of a continent which seems so sadly wedded to the ugly conceits of racism. Being neither a politician nor a social scientist, I have no suggestions as to how to combat tribalism or the resultant racism that continues to stain Europe. There are, however, people of all colors and nationalities, of many, many religions and political persuasions, who are attempting to wrestle Europe's face around so that she might at least be forced to stare into the mirror. I wrote the European Tribe as a contribution to this process. Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, thank you for revisiting the journey, even though...
Without my glasses.
Oh, sure. Move the chairs back a bit.
All right.
Good. Okay. So yeah, thank you for revisiting that journey and the European Tribe, even though, as you say, there are no return journeys. So I guess that's 30 years on from when you originally took that journey. So I thought I would begin by asking you about something that you also talk about in the conclusion of the book. You sort of discussed the way that you were reckoning with your sense of negritude in London, and you mentioned an instance when an editor called you a jungle bunny, and that in another instance you were asked which African languages you were fluent in and which ones you speak with other West Indians. And on the road you say sometimes you pretended to be Grenadian because people often didn't know where St. Kitts was, but were aware of what was happening in Grenada at the time and couldn't comprehend your Britishness. But yeah, reading the European Tribe really made me think that not much has changed from what you've written, because even for me, I visited Morocco this summer, and at the airport, showing my British passport, it wasn't enough. They had to ask, so where's your father from, though? And then where's your grandfather from? Because they just wanted to know where are you coming from exactly, right? So I wondered if you would just talk a bit more about this kind of misrecognition and what it means to be scripted into these different positions.
Well, when you're young, you think you can solve everything. You know, you think you've got you think you've got a lot of time ahead of you to redress every imbalance, which is no bad thing to think that. And then it comes a point where you realize it's up to the next generation to get on with it. So I'm not, it may sound like I'm a pessimist about what's happening, but what I said right at the end is true. There are lots of people working in different fields to continue this process of wrestling Europe's face around to look in the mirror and come to terms with herself. So I was a younger person, full of all the fire and impatience that the young should be full of, and now I realize that it's not going to happen within the parameters of my own lifetime, but I feel confident that change will happen. When I was, actually the year before I went to undertake this trip, I went to Birmingham, Alabama, to make a TV documentary about the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. I became good friends with the father of one of the girls that was killed in that bombing in 1963. And the premise of this program was 20 years after the bombing, Birmingham, Alabama now has a black mayor. It's a much more integrated city, theoretically. Let's go and see what's changed and how progress. And I got to Birmingham, Alabama, and met lots of people, including the mayor and including, Chris, the father of one of the girls that was killed, and realized that actually not that much had changed, despite the legislation, and came away understanding that 20 years is nothing. 20 years for a kid who's 24 is a huge, it's a lifetime. Yeah. But 20 years is actually a small slither of time to effect the kind of social change that one is anxious to see. Similarly, 30 years in Europe is it's a relative drop in the ocean to affect the kind of changes that one would like to see. I mean, it's moving in the right direction, and it's up to still my generation, but it's up to the generation that will come after and the generation that are emerging now to continue the work.
Right.
And in literature, in teaching, in social work, in all sorts of spheres, not just writing.
Right. And I guess 20 years isn't a long period of time, right? So when you visited my classroom earlier today, you talked about, I guess, the return journey you made to St. Kitts and seeing your great-grandmother and how 20 years wasn't really a long time for her.
No, well, I'm not quite as old as my great-grandmother was. But no, when I was growing up in Britain, of course, like most first-generation, my parents were first-generation migrants. I came as a baby with them. I wanted to know where I came from, because it was increasingly clear in the playground that, I was getting fed up with people telling me to go back to where I came from, including the police and teachers. So I would go home and I would ask my parents, where are we from? Where are we from? Because I don't think we're from England. I've got a suspicion we're not from here. And they would say, no, you're from here. You're from here. But I said, well, every time I have to fill in an official form, I have to put down place of birth, St. Kitts. Now, can we chat about this place? No, you're from here. Well, then my parents were first-generation migrants who wanted me to be rooted in the new country, which is understandable. So I did grow up with a very strong sense that there was another home somewhere, but I wasn't sure the degree to which that really was home. I didn't want to romanticize it. I didn't romanticize it, actually, even though there was a lot of pressure sometimes to do so. And a lot of my generation were beginning to romanticize the Caribbean and Africa as another kind of essential home. It was the 70s. It was the rise of Bob Marley, the emergence of Rastafarianism. There was a very strong sense of Britain isn't working for us, so we got to find another place. I went to St. Kitts after I finished college to try and find out something about myself. and my family, not to search for another home. And you know, having two parents who were born in St. Kitts, four grandparents who were born in St. Kitts, I knew that I couldn't write until I understood that place, because I wouldn't understand who I was if I didn't understand that place. I didn't have to exchange England for there, but I had to understand it in some way. And as you say, you know, one of the people I met was my great-grandmother, who had looked after me for the first 4 months of my life, and when she saw me again, she's still living in the same house, sleeping on the bed I was born on.
Wow.
And when she saw me, she kind of looked at me as if I'd just gone down the road to buy a bag of sugar. You know, it was just like, you know, I was expecting a bit more, you know.
Yeah. For this homecoming, right? And I mean, I guess following up with that, I mean, where do you feel the most in step these days and sort of at the right pace? Because you said that in St. Kitts, people immediately knew that you were English.
Yes, people. Yeah,
you walked too quickly.
I should have said. You know, I thought that one of the things about going to St. Kitts would be, you know, that people wouldn't notice me. There was a desire for anonymity, because in Britain I could never be anonymous, because I was always an issue, and you know, I had issue fatigue. So I wanted to go to a place where I just blended in, you know. But it didn't happen. In St. Kitts, you know, people would see me walking down the street and they'd say, "Hey, English," and I'd be like, "You talking to me?" You know. And of course, you know, it's because I didn't hold myself in the right way, or I was walking too quickly, and so I didn't blend. So you know but that's okay, because that means that I have to somehow deal with this. I have to take on the complexity of not quite belonging there either. It didn't faze me. It just was another thing I had to deal with. I had to try and understand. But sorry, Tao, your question was where do I feel at home? The only place. Go on.
You described feeling yourself as a vagabond in a way. I kind of wondered, do you feel it's best to constantly be on the move in a sense, or?
I don't think I ever described myself as a vagabond. But I know what you're getting at. A nomad, maybe. I don't think I'm any different from any of the other writers in this room. I'm most comfortable at my desk, you know, wherever that happens to be.
Writing.
Yeah, that's where I'm most myself. I mean, the question of stitching together, you know, I have three passports. I have an American passport, a British passport, a St. Kitts passport. But that's not as unusual in the 21st century as it was in the 20th century. That may have been, that kind of plurality of identity, or that kind of promiscuity of identity may have been slightly more unusual in the 20th century, and certainly in the 19th century. But in the 21st century, that plurality of identity is wonderfully problematic for a lot of young people today. It's not something that gives them a headache. It did give me a little bit of a headache growing up, because again, I was growing up in a time when, and in a country where there was a great deal of pressure on you to adopt a singular notion of yourself, a singular idea of your identity, your nationality. You know, Britain doesn't hyphenate, man, you know, like Irish American, Jewish American, but Britain doesn't do the hyphen. You can't be like an Irish Briton or a Swedish Briton. It doesn't. So the very language resists that plurality in the way in which the American version of English is open to a kind of more complex, heterogeneous sense of identity. So I did grow up thinking, I have to choose, or there has to be some kind of choice, but I resisted that, and I still do. I mean, it only becomes an issue for me now, to be honest, because I have children. And it only occurred to me when they were born that I lived in America. Because I'm not watching baseball. I don't care what they want to do. I can't do, I can't do it because I watch soccer.
Yeah.
And so I'm now beginning to see, okay, there will be some choices and there will be some cultural definition rather than keeping it somewhat amorphous. But again, that's something that happens with all migrants. As the first generation, the rusty hinge turns to the second generation. Choices are made and things open up, spaces open up, different fusions are made. Parents learn through their kids and kids learn through their parents. So nothing's decided yet.
Right. And I guess following along with that, in the European tribe, and just now you spoke about James Baldwin, and the Fire Next Time, he addresses that to his nephew, drawing this, genealogy and link and lineage to his nephew. And I guess I wondered if you would talk about your relationship with James Baldwin, and because you said he had this ability to kindle the imagination. And so in the essay you talk about how you made up this lame excuse to decline going to dinner with him and Miles Davis. And I wondered if you regret that at all. Would you have gone?
Well, no. I mean, what happened was I met Baldwin in 1983 in the south of France at his home in Saint-Paul-de-Vence, because I was sitting in London watching a television documentary that the BBC made about Norman Mailer called Norman Mailer at 60. And it was all right. I was interested in Mailer. I liked that fiction. I like writers who do fiction and non-fiction. So I was watching this thing, and then it occurred to me that James Baldwin was going to be 60 next year, and I thought they're never going to make a program about him. So I called my literary agent and I said, do you know anybody at the BBC, any producers who might want to make a program about James Baldwin? And she said, well, I'll ask around. And then she said, yeah, I know this guy who saw Baldwin at Cambridge in the 60s when he debated William Buckley. And it changed his life, and he was really interested in meeting you and maybe... Anyway, to cut a long story short, I wrote to Baldwin, care of his publishers, and he wrote back to me. I never thought he would get to him, but he wrote back and said, here's my phone number, call me. So I called him, very nervous of course, and he said, come down, see me. So me and this producer flew down to Saint-Paul-de-Vence to see him. So, 4 years later he was dead. Of course, I didn't know that at the time, and nobody knew that, and I thought that, this friendship would span out over X number of years. But in that 4 years, I knew him in France and in New York and in London and in Amherst, where he was teaching at UMass part of the time. I forgot what your question was, but he was incredibly important.
Right. Okay. And I guess one final question, then I'll open it up to the audience for questions. Let's see. So, Baldwin, or in that essay, Dinner at Jimmy.
Okay. Oh no, you asked me about Miles Davis and Jimmy. Sorry, I forgot.
Dinner this time.
No, well, the essay that I wrote about Jimmy in the European tribe was about a time when I went to his house in the south of France a year later, when I used to crash on the sofa upstairs. Jimmy lived in a little kind of one-bedroom studio thing downstairs, and he said to me one day, Miles Davis is at the jazz festival tonight, he's coming for dinner, do you want to have dinner? And I thought, no, because I thought I would just get in the way, because these are two guys that probably had things to talk about, and they didn't want some 20-something-year-old kid sitting there slack-jawed all the way through the dinner. There was no point of, I could talk to Jimmy, I could talk about books and I could ask him questions, but a three-way conversation struck me as being kind of ridiculous. And I didn't think that Miles Davis was probably the most patient of individuals either. So I went up to, I went up to eat by myself in the village, I think, and then I snuck back in later when they were getting smashed and laughing, and I just went to sleep listening to them laughing. Would I do that? I'd do exactly this. If I was now, I'm the age almost that Jimmy was then, so now I would sort of sit around slack-jawed but older. But back then I would do exactly the same again. I just felt that there was something about African American artists and France, because Miles Davis had lived in Paris, and loneliness, because they were both lonely. They needed a kind of fix from each other. They needed their fix and their chat and to slake their loneliness together without having to navigate anybody else,
Right. So you didn't want to interfere in that?
I would have been, a drag, to be honest. I would have been a drag, So I don't have any regrets at all.
And then also in that essay, you talk about how James Baldwin was working on evidence of things not seen about the Atlanta child murders. And I wondered if you would talk more about that time and that sort of violence, maybe in connection with the work that you've written on David Olawale and what that has meant to you, being from Leeds. And if you could just talk a bit about the sort of police violence and maybe growing up in Britain in the 1960s and 70s and sus laws and this sort of
the city I grew up in had one of the most notorious cases of police violence in post-war Britain, post-Second World War Britain, which is in 1969 a Nigerian was fished out of the river in Leeds dead, and he'd basically been hounded into the river and beaten by the police. A young man called David Olawale. And I was 11 at the time, and I remember it very clearly because you were taunted as a kid with kids saying to you, and not kids, adults, we're going to do to you what we did to Olawale, the we being the city of Leeds, or them, or the police. So the spectre of this man, for me, hung over Leeds. It was a national crime. It's still the only case in which police have been prosecuted, and they went to jail, these two policemen. There's many deaths in Britain every year of people in police custody, but this is the only case where the police were prosecuted. And I wanted to write an essay about Olawale, because in Britain people talk about migration and they talk about usually West Indians or about people from the Indian or from the Asian subcontinent. They often don't include Africa. So I wanted to write about this man who came to Britain in 1948, wanted to be an engineer, and 20 years later was dead. And killed by the city, literally, that he wanted to be a part of. That was, to all intents and purposes, my city. But as I began to write the essay, it became clear that I had to write the history of Leeds as well, because the history of this man is also the history of this city. So the essay is called Northern Lights, and it's in a book called Foreigners. And it haunted me. But then a lot of what's been happening in this country doesn't surprise me, in the last few years, because that haunts me too. Everything from Trayvon Martin forward to Ferguson, back before Trayvon Martin, it haunts me as well because, police violence cast a shadow over my youth. And people are writing about it, and people have responded to it in this country, and they'll continue to respond to it. But people have written about it in Britain too. Linton, my pal and contemporary, Linton Kwesi Johnson, has written about these issues. So, there's some synchronicity, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic around these issues of violence, official violence.
Right. Because it just struck me, especially with the title of Baldwin's essay, The Evidence of Things Not Seen,
Yes, sorry.
These things
Yes,
that we don't see.
well, it's a good... Well, Baldwin was a genius at titles. I mean, there's no American writer who was ever better at titles than James Baldwin. That fabulous fusion of the King James Bible and Henry James. Just amazing titles.
Right.
And The Evidence of Things Not Seen is a beautiful title.
Yeah.
It's not. I mean, I'll be honest. It's not his best book. It's The Lion in Winter writing. But what he's dealing with is now, in a sense, what people are debating in things like Black Lives Matter campaign and so on. It's people disappearing. It's people who are regarded as not worthy of being counted.
Yeah.
And 30 years ago he was trying to write about that at the end of his life.
Yeah, because it really made me think, connecting with David Oluwole, just even an instance this past summer in New Haven where severed legs were found, and it was a sort of mystery as to what happened. And then once it was known that it was this homeless man who was black, I think nothing really much more happened with the investigation, but we're sort of left with the sense of whose lives matter more. That if it had been a student, say at Yale, it would have been different. But
I mean, again, as I say, it's easy to feel, it's right to feel indignant and upset by these things, but I tend to feel that even if there's no official follow-up to these things, there seems to be a lot more consciousness and a lot more noise, if you like, about what is happening, and a lot less kind of complicit silence around these issues. So again, I feel, I don't feel too down about these things, because I think people are being vociferous and people are speaking out in a way perhaps that they hadn't done before.
Right. Now the noise is good then, right?
The noise is right?
The noise is good to speak up about all of these things.
Well, there's lots of different ways of speaking out. Writing a book is one way of speaking out, but also going on a demo is one way, voting is one way, teaching is one way. So I do think that there is, on both sides of the Atlantic, people are making noise, and come November they're going to have to.
Indeed. Okay, so now we'll open it up to questions. I think there's a microphone that should be available. So raise your hand if you have a question you'd like to ask.
You should have planted a question.
Well, my students are here.
Oh,
I know we have questions about the European tribe as well, right?
Is it on? Okay, great.
If you can identify yourself and say your name, where you're coming from.
My name is Jesse McCarthy. I'm a graduate student in English, 5th year. Thank you so much for this talk. It means a lot to me. I could just say, The European Tribe is a book that I was given by my parents in the early 2000s. I grew up in France, and it was an important book then, although I don't think I understood it then. But I reread it later, and I think I understand it better now. But I kind of wanted to ask you a sort of complex question, but it's sort of a question, I suppose, in a sense, about literary genealogy. One of the things that struck me about the European Tribe was some of the way you sort of, I thought in that book, were working through how a young writer, particularly a young black writer, constructs a sense of authority for themselves, right, in regards to the kind of canonical authority of that Europe sort of possesses in its own kind of, or asserts in its own way. And I remember even then being intrigued by, I think you mentioned it in the chapter on Amsterdam, that one of your early sort of forays into writing, maybe not professionally, but sort of just as a young person, was connected to sort of thinking about the Anne Frank story, and kind of identifying with that. And I remember also thinking in that book, at one point you had a quote from Bobby Sands, the IRA man, and this kind of sense of positioning oneself or identifying with Europeans that themselves were sort of in some ways already marginalized. And that made me think recently about how, you know, a director like Steve McQueen, I think it was his first, or one of his first movies, Hunger, right, takes up Bobby Sands in this kind of way of self-authorizing, but also kind of going through almost a kind of side door, or kind of a position of identifying with the marginal within Europe, perhaps. And Zadie Smith was here recently, and I asked her, in a sense, a sort of similar question about how one, as a black writer, sort of deals with canons that in which you don't always see yourself, or in which you might actually, in fact, encounter things that that really disappoint you or upset you. She had been talking about reading Michel Houellebecq, and I was a little bit surprised that she was in sort of approving of him, and so I sort of asked this question. But I gave the example just from my own experience of reading Saul Bellow, who I greatly admired, and then reading sort of Mr. Sandler's Planet and coming across certain passages that really, you know, upset and shocked me. And her answer was basically, and I thought it was a very good one, was, you know, well, you have to be ruthless as a writer. You have to, you know, bracket the racism, the things that you don't like, and take what you need from whatever works for you. And so all of this is a long sort of way of just saying, I wonder if you would talk a little bit about how kind of, what your sort of your attitudes have been, and sort of how you've felt maybe then at the time, sort of the 80s, and even up till now, about these kinds of questions of literary genealogy, and asserting your own authority within a canon that's not always sort of, as it were, designed for you to have a place in it.
Okay, thank you. I'm trying to think of an author for me who might be the same as Saul Bellow is for you, you know, who you might bracket off and just say, you know, I love or I admire them, but they have a certain myopia in this area, or a certain proclivity for navel gazing, or worse. You know, that's the first person that came to mind was Woody Allen. You know, I can't think of I don't think of anybody that has turned me off. You know, an author that's turned me off in that way. Maybe there's people that have taken their books and slung them across the room for various Naipaul, you know, various reasons. Some Naipaul. But the positioning thing is very interesting, because I've never approached literature as identity politics. It is what Faulkner said, it's the human heart in conflict with itself. And the human heart doesn't have a color, it doesn't have a race, it doesn't have, you know, it's the human heart. It beats to betrayal, it beats to fear, it beats to guilt. And growing up in Europe, I found a tremendous amount of sustenance and stability reading Irish writing, Anne Frank for sure. And to this day, I've never worked for the last however many years, 30 more years. I have a picture of Anne Frank above my desk, wherever my desk is. So I've looked for where I can find the human heart in conflict with itself and narratives which speak to me. And those narratives have often been narratives of people in Europe who you quite rightly identify have felt marginalized in some way or other. And that could be anybody from Miloš to Anne Frank to Brian Friel, the playwright, who I still think wrote the best play ever about the colonial encounter in translations, which is a masterpiece about colonialism and about empire. Those people, again, I think you're absolutely right, those people who have perhaps a somewhat oblique relationship to Europe, to the traditional European canonical narrative, I gravitate towards them a little bit, I think, and don't regard them as beyond my purview in any sense. And Steve, obviously, I know, not obviously, but I know Steve McQueen very well, and he's exactly the same. I mean, I know that from working with him and talking to him. Hunger, for him, the film about Bobby Sands, was natural for him to make. It was a film about a guy who feels in conflict with British authority and the British establishment. The fact that he's Irish didn't really matter, because the core issue is what keyed in for him. I hope that's one way of answering your question anyway.
Great. More questions?
Thank you very much for the talk and the ongoing discussion. I have a question and a comment I would like you to respond to. And the question seems to be apropos to what you said about identity politics. And if I got you correctly, there was a moment where you talked about how in order to be a writer, you had to go to St. Kitts or understand your hometown. And can I prod you to talk more about that, particularly given what you said, how you answered the last question? And the comment I have is, let me quote you again. You said that St. Kitts was not a home, it was not your home. But how would you respond to my suggestion that it was not a geographical home, but a home nevertheless, of some sort? Thank you.
I respond to your question by saying you're right. You know, it is a home. It is a kind of home. I mean, home, you know, I still think the finest definition of home is Frost. You know, home is a place where when you want to go there, they have to take you in. And I still feel, rightly or wrongly, that I turn up at Golden Rock International Airport in St. Kitts. They kind of haven't got a choice. I mean, they do, obviously. But I feel a sense of being of the place when I arrived there, and obviously a certain sense of not being of the place. But I feel the same at Heathrow. And actually I feel the same at JFK after 26 years in this country. So it definitely is a kind of home. I wouldn't want to choose between any of them, because I don't feel that that's a 21st century condition that should be dropped upon anybody. It seems to me a conceit from an earlier epoch, where you say to people, choose. And it's a kind of poisoned chalice to be asked to sup at as well, and often very reductive. But you're absolutely right, it is a kind of home. In terms of the first part of your question, you know, Graham Greene said the first 20 years of a life is what forms an author. You know, it all happens in the first 20 years. And I think he's absolutely right, because whatever anxieties you're going to be grappling with for the rest of your life, whatever fears and betrayals and worries that you're trying to tease out into some coherent narrative have been inculcated into your soul early. I don't remember leaving St. Kitts as hand luggage with my parents, but it had a profound effect upon my life. And in order to understand myself, and in order to understand them, I had to go back, and I had to be able to name the trees, and I had to be able to say what fruit that was, because I couldn't write about it otherwise. If you can't say what the trees are called, you can't write. So, because they're not all the same. That's called something different from that one. And there's like 200 versions of palm trees, so you're not going to get away with that either. You've got to be able to say what kind of palm tree. If you don't have that vocabulary, you don't have a part of yourself. And if you don't have any mastery of yourself, you can't write. So it is true to say that rather anxious, anxiety-riven journey with my mother, I should say, who was even more anxious than I was, because she was trying to figure out what I was going to find out now. That rather anxiety-riven journey that I made with her was kind of seminal, because it really made me realize how much work needed to be done, how deep this issue of belonging was. It wasn't easily solved.
Great. Another question? Okay. Well, I have one more question, and then maybe we'll hear from one of my students who are in the audience. So we talked about this, you quipped that you were hand luggage with your mother when you migrated to the UK. And I'd mentioned before that my dad talked about always noticing, and he was born in the UK, his parents are from Jamaica, always sort of noticing that West Indian migrants had this bag, or suitcase rather, that was always packed and ready to go, because there was this return journey that was, coming back to the Caribbean. And I guess, have you heard of a similar story, or noticed that suitcase or bag, and how can we think about luggage and baggage and sort of what we carry with us as migrants and what we can't kind of check, or kind of in the sense of a sort of letting go?
Well, I mean, in physical terms, I had relatives who came to England at the same time as my parents did in the late 50s, early 60s, who, after a certain number of years, left England. And they largely went to Canada rather than the United States, because it was easier to migrate to Canada. The laws were easier to navigate. So there was a number of people for whom that migration to Britain, if you like, didn't take. And they decided to seek to make a second migration. My parents, I think they were determined to stick it out. For somewhat personal reasons, I think they cut ties. They were very young when they left with me. My mother was barely 20. And I think they burned a lot of bridges by leaving. So I think it was difficult for them to have the literal suitcase at the ready to go home. But all journeys involve loss. There's a loss of something. You pay a price for a journey. You may gain something which will counterbalance that loss, but it involves a certain degree of loss. And migrants live with often live with a certain tinge of nostalgia which descends over their lives, which they can never get out from underneath. And I think my parents have that to a certain extent. A sense of they've gained a lot because their children were educated and their children went to university and participated in British life in useful and productive ways. But I think they feel a sense of loss. of something.
So something that can't be retrieved.
No.
Right? Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about your book?
About a lost child? Yeah. Well, coming back to, I should say The Lost Child is a novel that was published last year. Coming back to the whole question of childhood, I grew up 10 miles or 12 miles or whatever away from the Bronte's house. And, as a kid who loved literature, who loved reading, I was always aware of the fact that there was this thing outside of the urban environment that I grew up in Leeds, called grass and trees and heathland and moors, that I didn't see much of this because of the nature of the kind of concrete jungle I grew up in. But I discovered it through reading, even though it was only 10 miles away. And one of the authors I loved the most were, not just one, I liked the Brontes, because the dialect, I could understand the Yorkshire dialect that they wrote in. And I like many people, many writers, academics, critics. I was very fascinated by, one of the great mysterious characters in canonical English letters, Heathcliff. Where on earth did this 7-year-old boy who was discovered on the docks of Liverpool come from? That was described as kind of swarthy and gypsy-like, and where did this kid come from that created havoc in the bosom of this otherwise relatively stable English countryside? And I began to think a lot about childhood and a lot about the moors, and then I remembered another episode from my childhood, which was anybody who grew up in Britain during that time would be aware of the Moors murders, which happened in the 60s. Of two people, a man called Ian Brady and a woman called Myra Hindley, were abducting children and torturing them and killing them on the moors, and it became a horrible part of anybody's childhood in that period. Cast a huge shadow over my childhood because we were not allowed to go out to play by ourselves, etc. So I began to think about that as a narrative of growing up and how that changes one's view of, it's a loss of innocence. But then I couldn't get the idea of this other lost child out of my head, this Heathcliff figure. So the narrative is a kind of construction with two different time frames. One, a contemporary 20th century story of growing up and loss, and one, a kind of backstory of who Heathcliff might be, and his mother in particular. So it's, I'm sure there's all sorts of appropriate critical terms to describe what's going on, but it's two narratives sort of working simultaneously, which is looking at the construction of family and childhood and a kind of loss of innocence.
Well, I guess to follow up on that, there tends to be a very London-centric narrative of the UK as imagined from outside, and I wonder if you would talk about those sort of regional difference between the north and the south in England, and perhaps even in the US, that sort of difference, or how that relates to each other.
Well, the north, I only knew about the south of England when I went to university, because I grew up in the north of England in a working class family whose notion of England was it was very class conscious, very much around the rituals of family, region. There was not much mobility, geographical mobility, or not that much social mobility either. I went to university in the south of England and encountered a whole different England, a whole different group of people that I'd never met before, people who paid to go to school, people who travelled abroad for their vacations, people who had expectations of owning England, had a sense of proprietorial glee about their relationship with England rather than the sort of nervous anxiety, hesitant anxiety with which I was kind of clinging on by my fingertips. So I realized that that was very much a north-south divide, which was very much a class divide.
Right.
And of course there's a literature, including the Brontes, which illuminates the north of England as opposed to the south of England. And I found myself reading more and more literature from the north of England to try to find out again who I was, because until I moved to the south I didn't realize how northern I was. But then, you know, I left university and I moved to Scotland. Until I moved to Scotland I didn't realize I was English. You know, so sometimes you've got to go somewhere to realize what you are.
Right.
Because they tell you that you're not one of us, and then you have to think, what does that make me? So it was like that. When I went to Oxford I realized I was definitely a northerner.
Okay. And then I think we have time for one more question from the audience, perhaps.
You haven't worked me hard enough?
Thank you. She said it was because she was too scared to meet him. So I'm wondering if there was a little bit of that in you also.
Sure. I mean, he's a scary dude. I mean, I saw him play once in London. He doesn't really take any prisoners, does he? There's not a lot of small talk with him, so I think if Baldwin had said, you know, it's going to be me and, I don't know, Richard Pryor, I'd have said, oh, that could work, you know. But Miles Davis is a scary guy, I think. Absolutely. No small talk.
Okay, and with that, if we can thank Caryl Phillips for joining us today.
Thank you.
So yeah, there are books for sale outside, which Caryl will be signing. And yeah, thank you for coming today.
Thanks, Al. That was good. That was paying. Happy?